Right, so we're down to the last speaker. An organization or institution will preserve the problem to which it is the solution. Has come to be known as the shirky principle. Clay Shirky would hasten to assure you that he didn't name it the shirky principle, because he's not that kind of guy. But that's how it's come to be known. Probably one of the 3 or 4 leading thinkers in the world today about the interactions between distributed technologies, communities, and individuals, looking at wholly new emerging paradigms of how empowered individuals with these technologies can behave differently, create new kinds of institutions, new kinds of change in the world. He's a teacher at NYU. He works both on the citizen journalism side with the journalism institution there, and also with the post-grad course that looks at interactive technologies and their future applications. Interestingly, just to pick up on a little theme that's run through the conference, it was his students in interactive technology who did the early research work on how to change telepresence that led to Dialogue Cafe, for which we are incredibly grateful. They worked with a university in London. Clay is not just a globally known speaker and writer, he's also the author of a number of very, very widely read books. And indeed, he's just published one this year on the kind of new cognitive abundance that we've created in this environment and what it may lead to. It's my great honor and pleasure to welcome to the stage Clay Shirky.
Thank you very much. Yes, let me also say, as a citizen of NYU, it's a pleasure to be here with Tom, and it was a delight to hear John talking about NYU's Global University Project, which is quite extraordinary. So I want to talk today about the engagement of citizens directly in civic action. But rather than start by talking about that with examples, I want to start with a metaphor, if I can get the slides. There we are. Yeah, so skyscrapers. Skyscrapers are a marvel of the built world. Obviously, they have characterized one of the biggest differences between cities in the 21st century and cities in the entire previous history. And they required several separate technologies to be perfected in order to attain the heights they attained. And one of those technologies, obviously, was the elevator, because you simply can't have a tall building if people are traversing from floor to floor with stairs. And so the elevator was one of the things that allowed skyscrapers to become as tall as they were. Less well appreciated, however, is that another one of the inputs to making skyscrapers able to grow to these heights was a communications tool. Because at the time, roughly a century ago, at the time skyscrapers were coming into being, the state-of-the-art for communications within a large firm was pneumatic tubes that would route paper messages. But that system also didn't scale like stairs. And so another technology that was critical to enable the skyscraper to grow turned out to be the telephone. You didn't just have to lower the cost of moving people from floor to floor. You had to lower the cost of moving messages from floor to floor. Now, we don't often think about the built environment and the communications environment interacting this directly, but in fact they do. Skyscrapers would not have been possible without the phone. And the point is more general. When you change the communications environment, when you increase the carrying capacity of a group to send and receive and act on messages, you change what that group is possible, what is possible for that group. So let me tell you a story that I think illustrates that change that we can see in the world today. This is Ori Okola, who was a lawyer in Nairobi, Kenya. And Okola wrote and writes a well-read Kenyan blog called Kenyan Pundit. And at the end of 2007, in December of 2007, there was a disputed presidential election in Kenya. And there was, after this election, an outbreak of ethnic violence. And Okola was one of many people discussing this. It was in the media, it was in the blogosphere, and people were wringing their hands over what was happening in Kenya. And then suddenly, the state announced a general media blackout on reporting on the violence and a specific media blackout on any form of live reporting. You could not go out with a microphone or a camera and ask anyone anything live, nor could you observe anything live. And the blogosphere in Kenya went from being one of the sites in which the ethnic violence was being discussed to the primary site in which the ethnic violence was being discussed. And Akola began to solicit first-person reports from her commenters. What are you seeing? Where are you seeing it? Where is the violence happening? And after a short period of doing this, she said, I can't keep up. I could do this 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and I couldn't put as much information on my weblog as my commenters are providing to me. I wish there was some way to automate this. And a couple of programmers who read her weblog raised their hands in the comments and said, we could build that. And they got together, and within a couple of days, they had spec'd out the design for a tool which they called Ushahidi, which means witness or testimony in Swahili. And 2 days after they'd spec'd it out, they'd built it and launched it. Ushahidi is simplicity itself. It takes a message coming in, whether by SMS or email or the web, and it geocodes it and puts it on a map. That's it. That's all it does in its basic installation. It's become more complicated since then, but the 2008 version was just that function. But what it did was it took what the community knew tacitly. Everybody knew where the violence was because it had happened to someone, but no one person knew where all the violence was. And by building a map, they were able to take what the community knew in its distributed form and actually turn it into something you could see. Right? And when this period ended, when the violence had calmed down, the people who built this tool said, we're on to something. We want to do that again. We want to make this general purpose. And so they've turned Ushahidi into an open source tool, and now, as of August, also a cloud-based platform called CrowdMap. And if you go and look at the places it's been used, it was used in Mexico to track the risk of voter fraud. It was used in Washington, D.C. to track snow removal. First world problems. It was used most famously in Haiti to track the presence of both need and presence of supplies, as well as tracking things like violence. And if you go to the Ushahidi homepage now, you will find a map of all the places it's been deployed. It's been deployed worldwide. In less than 2 years, it went from being a civic idea expressed by one person on a weblog to being a piece of infrastructure now in wide use for crisis mapping. I want to call your attention to 2 features of Ushahidi that I think matter in this context. First feature, these tools don't get socially interesting until they get technologically boring. Right? Ushahidi was not primarily about technology design. Most of the pieces that made it work, the mobile phones, Google Maps, the web page, had been around for years, and in some cases had been around for well over a decade. Right? Ushahidi was principally an exercise in opportunity design, in taking the existing technologies and articulating them in a way that didn't just make something possible, it didn't just make an action possible, it also made it desirable. After building Ushahidi, the people who built it were able to go to the world and say, this is why you would participate. This is why you would tell us what you know about voter fraud in Mexico or about the presence of relief supplies in Haiti. Because if we all work together, a good thing can happen. And the second thing I want to call your attention to is that because it is not principally a piece of technology, right, the question, what is Ushahidi made of, isn't so much it's made of the code that runs on the server. What Ushahidi is made of, what makes it valuable, is coordinated voluntary participation. Right? And that is the change in the communications environment that makes novel civic action possible, is the ability to take very large-scale coordinated voluntary participation and to turn that into a resource. Right? Contrast that with the classic model of building anything in a civic environment, right? A bridge. The government decides where the bridge needs to be. The government commissions people to design the bridge. The government commissions people to build the bridge. The government commissions people to keep the bridge from falling down. Right? That model is the normal model for civic action in which an organization takes or is made responsible for an activity. And rendered diagrammatically, it looks like this. There is an organization. It either generates or takes in information. It processes that information. It makes a decision, and it decides to act. And yet, this model doesn't allow for what we see visibly happening out in the world now with things like Ushahidi, which is the presence and participation of the individual outside the organizational framework. So let's change this model to reflect that. One of the questions we can ask is, where can information come in from? And information come in from both organizations and users. I'm using the generic words here because this is a general change. This is as between governments and citizens, but also between NGOs and members and companies and customers. Right? The relationship between institutions and individuals now allows for much more contribution of an aggregation of information by individuals. You can look at the other side of the graph too. You can ask yourself about action, and there the same thing happens. Organizations can act in the world. In fact, acting in the world is what organizations are for. But again, as we know from examples like Ushahidi, individuals and loosely coordinated groups are all increasingly able to take action now as a result of these tools. Right? And if we take those two intuitions and overlap them, you get a grid. Right? So one thing that can happen in the environment we're in now is that users can provide information for organizations to take action on. Another thing that can happen is that the organizations can provide information for the users to take actions on. There are places where the users can provide information and take the action themselves, no longer needing a framing institution. And then, of course, there are still places, as is the ordinary case, where the organization generates the information and the organization takes the action. Right? So now we have a fairly simple but informative taxonomy for the involvement of people and groups not previously part of the civic landscape, who are now being able to be integrated in as a result of the changed communication environment. And we can walk through that and look at each of the quadrants and see some of the characteristics. So let's take the first quadrant, where the user provides information for an organization to act. You could call this user as sensor. Right? The canonical example here is the pothole. Right? In any given city on any given day, the citizens know more about where the potholes are than the government does because we drive over them every day. So each person knows where some potholes are, and everybody knows where all the potholes are, but nowhere is that information aggregated and made useful. And so you have now services like See-Click-Fix, Ben Berkowitz's service, that are set up to aggregate this information. This is, when people are talking about kind of civic action, the pothole example is the one that comes up all the time. As a result, I won't go into it in too much detail. I think it's been well discussed, but there is one thing I want to call your attention to about this example. It isn't just that, in this case, the organizations can use the citizens as sensors, can gather information now that all of us individuals have devices on us that can communicate and have cameras and GPS. It can also potentially change the relationship between those citizens and the government. See-Click-Fix is actually designed to be embedded in the pages of politicians. So this is a page from Fernando Cabrera, who's a politician in the Bronx, and who put See-Click-Fix on his page, not just to find out where the potholes are — the Bronx has famously bad roads — but also to have another way to reach his constituents. So you can bootstrap from the pothole, from the user as sensor, into greater civic engagement. Right? The other point I want to make about the generic language of user and organization is that this observation is general. There is a company, Get Satisfaction, whose entire business model is you will pay us to provide a place for your customers to complain in public. Right? That's not a business model that, had you had it in the 20th century, would have made much sense. Venture capitalists would not have been lining up to give you money to do that. But what's changed is that those people are going to be complaining in public anyway. You might as well get some good out of it. And so get satisfaction does the same thing as see, click, fix does. But here the relationship is between companies and individuals, where the complaints can be aggregated and answered. And it turns out that when the users see a company acting on their observations, it actually improves their loyalty to the company, even though they were driven to the site by a complaint. So this is not just a change in civic action. This is a change in the relationship between individuals and organizations, full stop. Right. The opposite pattern. The organization supplies information for the user to act on. Here you have an idea of smart consumers, where the information is put out and the user then takes it in and does something with it the organization couldn't do on their own. For instance, MapLight, which is an organization in California, takes election data and creates informative maps for citizens. Now, voting is, by definition, something that only citizens can do, but the state has an interest in getting voting to work as well as possible, right? And so rather than the government trying to figure out how to process and display this data, they simply make it available in raw form. And there are people out in the world who go out of their way to turn this into civic value. So this is a place where, by opening up its information, an organization can simultaneously lower the costs of managing that information, because the post-processing is done out in the world, and raise the value. And again, to the point about it not just being civic, but also commercial, right? There are a number of services that are using, this is a graph made using IBM's wonderful visualization tool, Many Eyes. There are a number of organizations that are using visualization to generate information about energy consumption as a way of getting people more directly involved in managing energy use and environmental issues. So again, a change in context overall, the ability to take data out of an organizational context, and by making it available, lower costs and increase value. Right? Then there's this, right? Users talking to users directly, right? Creating civic value without involving traditional civic organizations, right? Again, back to Ushahidi. A student of mine is going to Port-au-Prince next week to try to build a Ushahidi map of schools. And in Haiti, schools do not work, and particularly in Port-au-Prince, schools do not work like we are used to them working in the industrialized world. It is not that the government runs a handful of large schools. There are many small schools that will educate a few students at a time, but then get government subsidy if they can enroll enough pupils. And my student was there over the summer, and when she went around interviewing, she heard two things. She heard the schools saying, we may have to close because we can't get enough students. And she heard the parents saying, we would like for our children to be enrolled in school, but we don't know where open schools are. This isn't a supply problem. This isn't a demand problem. This is an information problem. And so what she's going to try to do is to build a map that surfaces the tacit knowledge. But rather than turning it into something like the potholes, where then the state goes out with an asphalt truck and fixes the potholes, she's trying to take the information she gathers about schools and put it directly in hands of the interested parents. Because one of the things we know, particularly after a disaster, is that the sooner children get back to school, not only the sooner does their education improve, but they're also better taken care of, typically better fed, and it frees up the adults who care for them to get on with rebuilding their lives during the time the children are in school. Right? So this seems like a complete opting out of the traditional civic model. In fact, a little bit like what Charlie Leadbeater was talking about yesterday, the sort of radical outside model. And yet, to do this, right, because it is a platform, existing organizations that support these kind of platforms have a disproportionately large effect. Right? Anyone who has a data set about existing schools or existing pupils, right, if they share it, can bootstrap this effort, even though it's going to end up being user information and user action. Support for the platform as a platform by the state or by interested other organizations, commercial organizations, NGOs, can have a dramatically accelerating effect on this kind of activity. And then there's the fourth category, which is organizations taking in information and then those same organizations acting on that information. And that seems like it is the shrinking of what we were used to as the dominant model in the 20th century. It's just simply the ecosystem is widened to include these other quadrants. But in fact, even here, things are changing. Right? If you look at something like Jennifer Polka's wonderful organization, Code for America, what Code for America does is it picks cities that want to experiment with this, and as it says, Boston, your new startup, it reaches out to entrepreneurial coders and says, we want to create a partnership between you and this city. Because whatever other problems cities have, they have IT problems, both systems management and information management. Everything from running the schools to picking up the garbage to fixing the potholes relies on information, and yet cities have a series of bespoke, brittle, stovepiped systems. And the prospect that each city will have to rewrite or redo that from scratch, particularly, and John alluded to this, particularly at a time when everyone is being pressured to do more with less, isn't going to work. Interestingly, Code for America was founded before the full enormity of the current financial crisis became clear, but it is nevertheless visibly what we need to have happening. So Code for America says to the programmers who want to sign up to help, not only are you helping Boston, in this case, manage its school attendance rates, this is the information problem for 2011 that the coders are taking on in Boston, but if your code runs there, it can probably run in Boise, and it may be able to run in Barcelona or Brisbane because it's open source and because cities have similar problems. So the possibility that the people working on these tools will create something that is not just the classic, oh, I was commissioned by the city of Boston to write something for the city of Boston, but rather, I used Boston as a platform to work out a piece of software that then spread worldwide. We do not know yet whether this will work or not, but it is the kind of attempt that is possible now that would not have been possible 5 years ago and certainly would not have been possible 15 years ago. Right? The communications landscape that allows for the aggregation of coordinated voluntary participation is the thing that makes Code for America possible. So even in this case, right, where the spread of this tool is very much the Chinese restaurant menu that we heard from Pratham, where these tools, if they work, can spread without needing to be franchised or without needing to be pushed to the top. That indicates that even in the quadrant where it is still the organization's core responsibility to manage the problem, the communications landscape and the change in the communications landscape and the change in the participation landscape means that even this quadrant is operating in a different context. Right? That the ability to take coordinated voluntary participation and to integrate it into thinking about civic action in any of these four quadrants, different as they are, is the one commonality across all of them. So we've seen the internet as a platform for civic action for some time now. But for most of that time, it has been a series of special cases. Anu Shahidi here, a pothole fixing effort there. Someone has crowdsourced funding for a school. What I think is happening now is that we're starting to see enough special cases that the general shape of the environment is starting to become clearer. We're starting to have some sense of what's possible, and I think critically, we're starting to have some sense of what questions we can ask. And I would ask four. If you're looking at a situation where you're thinking about catalyzing civic value, you ask yourself, do the users know something the organization doesn't know, individually or in aggregate? Is there some piece of information out there that the organization would like but can't get to, and how can we fix that? Question two, does the organization know something that the users would like to know so that they can act on it? Is there a data set? Is there information inside the four walls of the organization, the company, the nonprofit, the government, that can be made transparent, that can be shared outside so that people can internalize it and take it and act on it. Third question, is there a place where improving the platform will improve the citizens' ability to create this value for themselves? Right? The easiest service to offer is the service you neither have to create nor manage. Right? But that doesn't require no involvement from the organizations. In fact, when you look at Ushahidi, right, it's clear that the decisions the Kenyan state made to have a robust telecom market, to have good internet penetration in the cities, those kinds of decisions had as much to do with making Ushahidi possible as the work of the Ushahidi designers did. The fourth question is, can the users, can the citizens, the members, the customers, do anything to accelerate or improve the orderly functioning of the organization whose goals they often share? Again, John's saying, I get a lot of information from listening to my customers. That's a case where an organization and the individuals are in a kind of partnership to make the whole ecosystem better. And if you ask those four questions, user information, user action, platforms for the users, platforms for the organizations, and the answer to any of those questions is yes, right, then you're looking at a situation where the changed communications landscape means a potential change in civic action. So let me end with this image. This is a street party in my neighborhood in Brooklyn. And I love it as a picture of what's possible on a civic platform, in part because it's a fun day, but in part because it makes it clear how much the civic is really the social and the organizational intertwined. Right? This street party could not have happened if the city of Brooklyn had not said, we're shutting off this street from here to there on this particular day for these hours. Right? Making that platform possible was the city's job. But this street fair also wouldn't have happened if that neighborhood didn't have the kind of social capital that would get people to turn out and enjoy being on the street with each other. Right? And that kind of interesting, messy, somewhat chaotic, but ultimately successful effort is some of what's possible. Civic action in the 20th century became in many ways much more technocratic, much more bureaucratic for all kinds of reasons. But one of those reasons was that large-scale action typically required highly managed hierarchical organizations and was not well aided by loosely coordinated aggregates. What we're seeing now, and again, the Pratham story, I think, brought this home. What we're seeing now is that there is also a place for loosely coordinated aggregates. It's not that hierarchy goes away. It's not that the state withers. But it is that the state no longer has a monopoly on either generating or acting on information. And the possibility of taking organizations as a platform and the loosely coordinated aggregates and making something hybridized is, I think, really important. In this decade that's just ending, humanity became a majority urban species, right? For the first time in history and for the foreseeable future. And on top of that, over the next 40 years, we're going to up our head count by about 2 billion people. Even Cisco doesn't grow that fast. Right? And we're going to have to get good at living together. Because for most of us, most of our lives will be spent living with a lot of other people close by in a built environment. Right? And a big part of learning to live together is going to be learning to take advantage of these kinds of hybrids. Like the skyscraper and the telephone, we need the communications tools that increase our carrying capacity. And like the street party, we need a place where the platforms, the orderly platforms and the somewhat disorganized social mess work together fruitfully. I think the opportunity there is enormous. Thank you very much.
Clay, that was absolutely stunning. Thank you very much. We do have time for a couple of questions, and I think we'll start with Gordon right at the back left there.
That was brilliant, Clay. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm wondering about the diagnosis on Obama's inability to translate the power that he generated with the social capital of a bottom-up movement. And then he enters the vortex in which power in Washington, D.C. is all power over, no power with.
Yes.
And he is unable to really bring that to bear on the Washington process. Now, you could say it was the ossified, crystallized dinosaur nature of the political institutions in Washington, but I think that's sort of a throwaway line. Right. And I just wonder what your diagnosis of that ailment is, because it might help us, particularly when public institutions are trying to bring that social capital to bear on resistant institutions in this room. Yeah. Not the people here in this room, but the ones they're going back to.
Yes. So, I mean, first of all, yes, that and that moment, and I think many of us, at least in the States, if you had had anything to do with the Obama campaign in its run-up 07 and 08, David Plouffe had your email address, and after he was Obama's campaign director, and after Obama was elected, mail from David Plouffe came in. And you think, well, this is it, right? But now we've got this incredible organization, exactly as you said, what now? And it's David Plouffe wants another $25. And you think, that's it? It's still just fundraising? And that was, for me, the moment of, oh, maybe this isn't going to work. So although there is certainly plenty of ossification in Washington, and obviously worse now in part because of the pressure of the economy, I think the key thing is that the Obama campaign made one very early, to my view, almost catastrophic misstep, which is that the day after the election, when he had won, they launched change.gov. And the model for change.gov was, here's a website where you can put the briefing book on the president's desk. You tell us what issue is most important to you. This is the first briefing from the American people directly to the president. Number one issue, most important thing in America, medical marijuana, right? Allowing medical marijuana nationwide. We're in the middle of two wars, not counting the war on terrorism, worst financial meltdown in 70 years. Medical marijuana was not only number one, it was 5 of the top 10 and 16 of the top 50, right? So it was classic. There was a well-organized political action group who had a legitimate point. But because they had designed the system so that for me to be heard, you have to not be heard. I have to push your opinion down to get my opinion up. They actually created a situation in which they not only embarrassed themselves, but they visibly surfaced as the principal issue something that no poll of Americans would have put as number one. And I think the design challenge there is to understand that government is always factionalized. Right? You will never have, hand-in-hand bipartisan compromise. You will always have factions fighting. But the missed opportunity, literally right the first day that we knew that guy was going to be president, the missed opportunity was not to create a more inclusive process that could say, we hear you on the war on drugs and those issues are here. We also hear you on K through 12 education and the Iraq war and the financial crisis. And not to force people to fight with each other about those issues. Because there was never going to be a moment where Obama was going to be forced to do what was in the briefing book, but they designed the system as if it was. And they are now, just now, coming back. You could look for the Expert Labs wiki, looking for alternate ways to get factional balance in listening to the American people. But we lost the 2 years in which there could have been continuity from the campaign to actually try something like that. So we don't know how much the ossification of Washington culture would have dragged it down, because to my eye, it ended almost literally as soon as it started.
Next question. Just here on the right.
I don't know if we're waiting for mics. Yeah.
Yes. My name is Jan Quezado. I am from Portugal. 7 years ago, Karl Popper wrote a famous book, The Open Society, we live in an information society. Do you think that the information society is an open society?
Is the information society an open society? Well, that's the million-dollar question.
And can you tell us what you think about WikiLeaks at the same time?
Yeah, well, so it's plainly WikiLeaks is going to be. I'm as you may. I wrote something on Monday saying how conflicted I am about WikiLeaks, which I'll talk about in a moment. But in January, the Secretary of State made a big public plea for internet freedom being a pillar of U.S. State Department practice. The idea that citizens in a given country should have access to information all over the internet was one of the leading pushes of this internet freedom idea. I think the much bigger question about in the West, I think we have a bad habit of thinking we have the source code to democracy, and if only people could tunnel through their firewalls and get it and compile it locally, everything would be, come up roses. Not visibly true. Countries become more democratic with local demands about local conditions, not because somebody's been exposed to James Madison. So the real question of the information society as a free society is not so much how much access to information you have, although that's somewhat important. It's how much ability do the citizens have to coordinate with each other. That is, I think, the key question. And I actually have something coming out in Foreign Affairs in a couple of weeks, arguing that the State Department ought to reprioritize around this idea of social access rather than information access. WikiLeaks is phenomenally complicated for all kinds of reasons. Anyone who thinks about system design knows that over the long haul, it's very bad to have individual actors that have no checks and balances, right? Someone who can at will publish anything they like is a different question than what's going on with the current leaked secrets from the State Department. Because imagine that someone got access to the entire communications history of every teenager on Facebook and began to release that, right? I think we would all recognize that as being unacceptable. So we have to separate WikiLeaks' capabilities in the system from the information it currently holds. And we do not want WikiLeaks to be, in fact, we don't want anyone to be a completely unconstrained actor because of the amount of harm that can be done. On the other hand, in the short term, it seems to me that it is the profound risk of WikiLeaks right now is that the United States will completely blow our ability to speak with any legitimacy on the idea of internet freedom if we just run some organization off the internet because we don't like it. And the extra-legal attempt to essentially take down part of the internet namespace without even charging the guy with a crime, much less having a trial, is a horrifically dangerous principle. So although I believe that WikiLeaks should be, and in fact, any other organization that operates in the same way, should be constrained somehow in the long run because of this sort of notional risk of unconstrained actors and Facebook data or nuclear launch codes or whatever it is. I don't believe that can be outside the rule of law. And history says that democracies do a good job of getting to the right answer, but they don't do a good job of getting to the right answer quickly. We need time to work through this, and I think the vigilantism, both against WikiLeaks and the awful, Operation Payback in the other direction, are both terrible, terrible precedents. And my hope is that if Eric Holder thinks that Julian or that WikiLeaks have committed crimes, that he will charge them and he'll be extradited and we'll have an orderly trial. And maybe he'll be found guilty. That part I don't know. What I do know is that taking WikiLeaks off the network without any due process means it's going to be awfully hard to go back to Burma and ask him to open up.
Yeah, now, let me try this. We have time for one or two more questions.
Oh, yes. Nicely done.
What John didn't realize was I'd actually agreed with Bronte. No. Who'd like to ask a question? Right up the back there.
Hi, my name is Dirk van der Woude from Amsterdam. You said a bit about payback. But isn't it so that, in a way, we are in the first days of World Cyber War #1? Because nowadays, dad wants to do his homework, mom wants to watch the TV, and the child says, I'm going to fight against Japan because they kill off the whales. How are we going to make a difference between that in the connections that we want to disturb and the connections we want to keep? I mean, massively young people nowadays are fighting for those principles they believe in. And I think this genie is out of the bottle. How are we going to work to live with that?
So, the fact that you're from Amsterdam pleases me enormously because in the 16th century, Amsterdam was the spot where the printers moved when the Catholic Church was tightening the noose in France and Germany and Italy. And the printers set up shop in Amsterdam, and the Protestants had some place where they could print Bibles in English and reprint the writings of Martin Luther and so forth and so on. And it was the ability of the Dutch printing industry, and particularly the printers in Amsterdam, to escape the church's ability to say only church-approved literature comes out of this box, that kicked off a good part of what we like about the Western world. But it was not then the case that the printers got to do anything they liked at any time. A whole set of secondary constraints, libel laws, trade secret laws, and so forth, not all of which I agree with, but all of which were put together in an orderly fashion by the democracies of the world, and in some cases when printing arrived to the autocracies, by the governments of the world, around that technology. So I don't know what happens to the 4chan kids, running LOIC in a DDoS attack against MasterCard or PayPal or what have you. Because DDoS is a hard class of problems to solve on a network designed the way the current internet is, just as spam is a hard class of problems to solve. We will probably never be able to get rid of it entirely. We will probably just work to reduce it to whatever we consider acceptable levels, as with spam. What I do know is that the current environment doesn't afford us the choices we need, any more than the 16th century afforded Europe, and particularly Northern Europe, the choices they needed, right? Between the Catholic Church having total control and the printers having no control whatsoever, that was a bad choice. And what happened was the Catholic Church was seen off, but the printers nevertheless came into some kind of social embrace. So I do think the genie is out of the bottle, which is to say, if I knew a way to be seeing off either the DDoS attacks or to keep WikiLeaks up until Holder charges Julian, I would be phoning someone and telling them my brilliant idea. I don't have that brilliant idea. But I do know that society has never gone long with unconstrained actors without suffering serious consequences. And it is that, and I don't know if it will be social, I don't know if it will be technological, I don't know if it will be legal, it will probably be some mix of all of those things. But I think that the short-term totalization of either the United States can just decide to make something vanish from the internet with no due process, or a ragtag bunch of 14-year-olds with too much time in their hands hanging out on 4chan can bring down the world's financial system. Both of those are bad options. And I think that the wrestling into some democratic process becomes the really essential challenge we've got right now. And the key thing that democracies need to get to the right answer, sadly, is time.
Clay Shirky, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much. Thank you all for having me.